Now that we have our core development environment installed, one of the next things we need to do is set up our virtual devices, or what we commonly call emulators. Basically, the Android virtual devices, we call them AVDs or emulators, allow us to test our apps on our desktop. In other words, we don't need to have an actual device. Now, in environments like iPhone, iPad, the iOS space, emulators in that case are fairly simple because Apple very closely controls their devices. In the case of Android, Android devices are highly varying. So there can be a lot of different target environments that your applications will run in. So what happens is that when we set up an AVD, we need to think about our target environment and think about testing them in different environments. So basically, we have these things called AVD definitions that describe characteristics of a device. And what we're talking about is that these are things like, well, what are the screen characteristics? What's the resolution? Right? What's the density of it? Right? Does it have a device have a physical keyboard? Does it have a GPS? Does it have a rear-facing camera? Does it have a front-facing camera? Right? There are all these different points that could be varied and different. And the settings and values for these are all wrapped up into what we call an AVD definition. It's a description of what a device would be like. And these are sometimes descriptions that match real shipping devices that one could go buy in a store. In many cases, they're just generic sets of characteristics that we can test with. And then when we have these AVD definitions, what we can do from those is we can then create an AVD image, right? So an AVD definition describes a device, but you don't actually work with a definition. You work with an image. And what happens is that we then go off and just create an image based on a definition. So whatever those characteristics are copied over. And we copy those over. Some of those characteristics can be specialized. You can change the amount of memory, maybe the size of the SD card. A few other things you can kind of tweak. Now, one thing to be careful of is that when you see this diagram and you kind of hear the description, one's initial thought might be that, I can think of a definition as kind of like a class in programming, and an AVD image is like an object, right? An instantiation of that. And you got to be careful with that mindset because there's no link between a definition and an image after it's created, right? So once you do that, that link between them is broken. So if you were to go back and change the definition after the fact, any images created prior to that will not be affected because the image gets copies of the information inside of the definition. There's no link between them there. But the key thing is, though, is that now once you have an image defined, you can now go off and you can run your code on there. So it gives you a place to go off and test your applications without having to have a physical Android device to work with. And that's kind of valuable for a couple of reasons. I mean, one thing that I will tell you is that, and I'll say this a bunch throughout the course, throughout the whole course series, is that if you're doing this for real, you need to have a device. You need to test your code on a device. But you don't have to have every possible kind of device. The emulators come in very handy for testing how you behave in different characteristics. We'll talk about there are certain scenarios that only work well on hardware devices, real-life devices. But if you're talking about how do I look on this resolution versus that resolution, things like that, the emulator images or the AVDs come in really handy for that. One thing to note is I will tend to use the term AVD, right, Android Virtual Device, and emulator interchangeably. Right? But the key is that we get these AVDs set up, and we now have the ability to test our code on our desktop, not having to have access to a real device or having all the different permutations of real devices. Now, the Android Virtual Device Manager is, as its name implies, the utility we use to manage our devices. Right? It provides access to existing definitions. It provides access to the images. Right? So we can work with that. So when you look at it, when you very first open it up, you'll see any devices you have already defined. Now, this is a screenshot from one of my machines where I happen to have one device already defined. The first time you open it up, it'll be completely blank. What we want to look at now for the beginning is that if we want to go ahead and create an image, we start out with our definitions. And these definitions are pre-configured layouts of different devices. Right? Now, some of these can be based on real devices, as I mentioned before. And so, like the one I've got pointing to there, that's provided by Google, and it's based on the characteristics of a Galaxy Nexus device. Right? The screen size, the resolutions, the configuration, all that stuff. Again, there are also ones that are just generic definitions that allow us to say, well, I want to see what it looks like on a screen this size, or what on a screen this, with this kind of screen definition or density, right? Those sort of things. Now, if you want to, and if you know you're dealing with a certain situation, in fact, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that if you're doing a line of business development, where you're going to be targeting devices in a particular environment or certain characteristics, you can go ahead and define your own device definition as well. Or if you go out to that new device button, you click on that, it'll bring you up a screen that allows you to very precisely describe what a device looks like. So if you're dealing with some unusual circumstance, you can define your own layout for all that and work with that. Now, that is certainly the exception. In most cases, we can deal with the ones that are predefined. Now, the AVD manager is something we're going to use a lot because we're going to have to launch our emulators and so forth. Accessing the AVD manager is very easy. Is that right on our Eclipse toolbar? There's a button right there that allows us to just click on that, and that'll go ahead and launch our AVD manager for us. So now when it comes to creating one of our virtual devices, right, what we're normally going to do is we're going to be in the AVD manager, and we're going to choose which one of our definitions we want to start with. So in this case, I'm starting with the Galaxy Nexus definition. Right, when we're ready to go, we go ahead and just say Create AVD. That'll bring up the screen that we work with on that. It allows us to actually create it. And you see it defines things like what's the target OS, or what's the keyboard characteristics, all those sort of things. Now, one of the first things you might want to look at changing there is the name, right? Because if you want to create a couple of these with slightly different characteristics, maybe different memory layouts or that sort of thing, you can't have conflicting names as you would expect. But if it's the first one you're creating, you can go ahead and accept the default name. Now, one of the areas we have to be careful on, especially on Windows, is when it comes to the memory options. This defaults to 1024. On most Windows machines, 1024 does not work particularly well. What I find works well for me is basically instead of 1024, just use 512, and everything I've ever tested with it works just fine, and that works well. The other thing to consider is the SD card. Of course, SD cards are kind of key parts of our devices, right? Virtually all real-life Android devices ship with an SD card. And so you want to set a size for that. I know for me, very often I'll just set 32 meg, and that's so now my emulated image, my AVD, has a 32 meg SD card attached to it. Once I do all that, I go ahead and just click OK, and it'll go ahead and give me an emulator configuration that I can work with.